corruption scandal, Treasury steals the only lifeboat, and the transnational swindle robbing Australians blind. Coming up on this week's episode of the Citizens Report. Welcome to the Citizens Report. It's the 15th of August 2024. I'm Robert Barwick and I'm joined today by Citizens Party researcher and writer Richard Bardon. Welcome, Richard.
Thanks, Robbie.
In this week's show, we're going to talk about something we just put out a release on, which is there's been a referral of Treasury officials to the National Anti-Corruption Commission over something that's frankly mind-blowing in terms of what it means of how corruption really works in Australia. And I'm going to get you to talk about, in quite a lot of, as much detail as we can, how this gas cartel is ripping Australians off, but it just shows you how weak governments are in the face of it, and especially the most disappointing government in history, the Anthony Albanese government. But anyway, we'll get to those in a minute. Let's just a few other things first before we begin. Remember, this information is not just information. We report things that we're trying to change, and we need your help for that. So the way you can help is like the show on social media, share it with everybody you can. If you're not a subscriber, please subscribe and ring the bell icon. Comment below. The feedback is invaluable, and I do read the comments and try and respond as I can. And to support what we're doing, hit the donate button and make a contribution as well. That's greatly appreciated. Also, before we begin, a few quick updates. A month or two ago, Andrew Gee, the independent member for Calare, and Bob Katter, the independent member for Kennedy, introduced in Parliament the Keeping Cash Transactions in Australia bill. And Parliament is sitting this week and next week, and it's the sitting after the winter recess. And of course, in the winter recess, we had the incident that happened just before you and I were last together, which Richard and I did the show on, the CrowdStrike outage. And the CrowdStrike outage did generate a lot of discussion about the lunacy of not having cash in the economy and allowing the banks to get rid of cash. Because you're left high and dry if you don't have any cash under those circumstances. And there will be more of these kinds of outages. As surely as the sun comes up in the east, the system will go down. And you don't want to be caught stranded when it does. Especially because, probably, Richard, you can predict the system will always go down because it seems to be run by people who don't believe it will ever go down. There's no contingencies in place.
No.
And the sort of people who what were you reporting this morning? They applaud events like half an hour when the national grid had
72% of renewable energy generation, of the total energy demand
for half an hour
for 30 minutes in the middle of the afternoon.
And they call it the half hour of power.
Yeah, with a straight face.
So with those people in charge, you can guarantee we're going to have more outages, right? And so anyway, in all seriousness, we need an inquiry into this bill. This bill needs to pass. In fact, we shouldn't need an inquiry. Just pass the damn thing. And I think there will be a lot of appetite for that in Parliament. But we want to get an inquiry up into it. So next week, hopefully, there will be a Senate Economics Legislation Committee inquiry into that bill. Because what we want to do is put out the word to everybody, make a submission of that inquiry, demand they pass it. It's total common sense to pass it, but also to demand, well, hang on, if you're going to make businesses accept cash payments, they need banks.
Yeah, this would be effectively make it a companion bill to the postal bank bill.
Exactly, the postal bank will allow that bill to work because only if you have banks readily accessible to businesses so they can bank their takings, will that actually work properly. So that's what we need to do. So watch out for that. But what you can do in the meantime is contact your local Member of Parliament and say, look, we need this bill. You need to vote for this bill. And to make it work, we need the postal bank. But we'll put out more on that in coming days, so look out for that. And then I got just related to that, but I want to tell a funny story. We were discussing before the cameras started rolling about whether we use a video clip of this or not, but we won't. But I just want to give you an example of if you weren't cynical enough about politics. Yesterday there was a vote in the Senate, and the vote was on Senator Pauline Hanson's bill to stop discrimination against people who didn't take the COVID-19 vaccine. And clearly, I mean, there shouldn't have ever been any discrimination, but clearly in 2024, there's no grounds for any remaining discrimination against people who didn't take the COVID-19 vaccine. Anyway, the usual people debated the bill, and they had a debate. The reason we're talking about this, though, is because what happened next. They went to a vote, and the Labor senators all filed in and sat where they were told to by the Labor whip. Her name's Senator Anne Urquhart from Tasmania. She actually had participated in the debate. But this is how the major parties vote in Parliament. So they're told where to vote. We might even put some of the general footage on the screen as I'm talking about this. They're told where to vote, where to sit so they can vote, either yes or no. But they don't even know what they're voting on.
And they don't pay attention to what's being said in the room as they're voting.
Exactly. And what if they had been paying the slightest bit of attention, they would have noticed that they're all on the same yes side as Pauline Hanson and Malcolm Roberts and people like that, including Senator Gerard Rennick and others who were for the bill. And even though Senator Urquhart had given a speech against the bill, but she didn't bother to pay attention, they were all on the yes side, and none of her colleagues bothered to pay attention. And so the bill passed. Pauline Hanson got a bill passed, and just as they finished counting the votes, Senator Urquhart realised, this was a mistake. So they quickly retook the vote so that it failed, right? They overruled the previous vote with a new vote. I'm telling this story just so people understand, look, when we say to you, call your Member of Parliament, you've got to understand it's your duty to inform them because they're not informing themselves. If you're not calling them and informing them about these kinds of issues that we raise, don't expect them to know anything. And that fiasco in Parliament yesterday is an example of that.
I think golfers call it a mulligan or something.
That's right.
Do that one over.
Do that one over.
Pity we can't do that with a federal election, eh?
Exactly. How many times a week after the election we thought, hang on, we should
Or
have done that.
a day after.
A day after. Okay. All right. And then just final update, much more serious. This is on Dan Duggan, the former Top Gun pilot, naturalised Australian, who's been in jail now for almost 2 years as the Attorney General processes the American government's request to extradite him to America, supposedly for the crime of training Chinese pilots that they claim were military pilots, etc. We've done a lot on this. You can look at our website for the various write-ups and the video presentations that we've done, and I've done extra videos. In fact, producer will put a link below to the latest video I did with the Canada files. You can watch that. So I don't want to go into all that detail. There's an update there below, half hour update you can watch on that. But the update now though is that next week is when Dan Duggan will make his final submission to the Attorney General. And this is after almost 22 months in maximum security, a lot of that time in solitary confinement. And in prison, Dan Duggan has actually written a poem. And I wanted to read it out because I hope people can put themselves in their position, in his position. And sometimes it's a hard thing to do because what happens when the government takes extreme action against somebody? The human psychology is you want to assume that where there's smoke, there's fire. There must be some grounds for that. Right? That's what you want to assume. And the more we've looked at this case, I'm convinced there's not. But we're not prosecuting the case in a court, so we can't prove that. But what I am thoroughly convinced of, Richard, is that there's no way Dan Duggan will get any kind of fair hearing or fair process in the current political climate, which we're going to talk about in more detail later, especially in the way we are so sycophantic towards the United States. we're going to publish next week in the Alert Service some interesting historical stuff that came out this week by James Curran, the history professor at Sydney Uni, who goes through, which we won't go through now, but he goes through these examples from the Keating prime ministership, where Keating actually took on Washington and stood up to Washington in a way that when you read it, you think this is almost impossible to relate to. We don't have politicians who do this now.
And
right?
just quickly, Keating was the pro-America guy in the Labor Party at the time. He was from the right faction that was pro-America.
He used to bat down the lefties, like Albanese was in the left faction, and people like Keating used to bat him down and say, no, America's our ally, we've got to stick with it, right? But even that Keating had more of an independent streak towards the Americans than anything in there now. They are such sycophants now. They are on their knees, and there's no way Dan Duggan's going to get any kind of fair hearing or fair process. And I'm absolutely convinced of that. And that's where the Australian people have to look at this case and realise, no, if we believe in principles of law and justice and due process, etc., we shouldn't tolerate this. But I did want to read his poem, because if you know the Dan Duggan case, he's got a wife, Australian wife, Safrine, 6 children, and they are working tirelessly on his behalf. Safrine was going to sell her property to fund his legal defence, and just as the sale was about to go through, the Americans got it frozen in court, right? So they've got their hands tied behind their back, and that's why they're desperately trying to raise money for all the legal stuff they do. And you can see that reflected in this poem. So the poem goes like this. Dan calls it Love Trumps Power. Is it to be power or love that will win the day? In a David versus Goliath battle, a family embroiled in geopolitical fray. The children's love is beautiful, kind, warm, infinite, from all 6. Power is often ugly, nasty, cold, secret, enough to make you sick. In solitude thought of laughter-silvered wings, he dances the skies, his heart soaring as he dreams of his wife's loving eyes. So that's Dan Duggan's poem. Next week, the Duggan team will present the final submission to Attorney General Mark Dreyfus, explaining the injustice, the political motivation behind his being targeted, the complete lack of evidence and facts, and the way in which the United States is extending itself into Australia and compromising our sovereignty. All right, Richard, let's get into it. Corruption scandal. Treasury steals the only lifeboat. Now, I'm glad we're doing this story today, because the Citizens Party has often taken up very important causes in the past, and people who've really been watching the Citizens Report for years will know that when we're on a case, when we're on a campaign, it's all dominating, right? Every week is an update on that campaign, and then when there's a certain resolution or end of the process, and with other campaigns come up, then we have to move away from that subject, and you feel bad about that, because there's often something about those issues that you want to update people on. Well, this is an example of an opportunity to do that, because this is about, I wanted to highlight an update on the Sterling First campaign. And Sterling First was a campaign that we fought furiously in 2021, and it relates to a financial crash, a financial collapse of a scheme mainly in WA, but there was victims around Australia, of elderly people who had been talked into selling their houses and downsizing into smaller homes for which they paid rent in advance for the rest of their life, right? So sell a property for $400,000 or something. Here, look, $240,000. It was either 40 years or the rest of your life, whatever came first. And the ages they were, it was the rest of their life, right? And so for them, this was a good deal. And it started in 2015, and a whole bunch of these people, mainly around Mandurah and WA, got into this. Except it wasn't a good deal. No. The thing was a scam, unfortunately. But it wasn't their fault. It was that they got sucked into a scam, because they did their due diligence. And in fact, I interviewed on the Citizens Insight one of the Sterling victims, Beryl Taylor, and as she's told us, before she got into it, she called up ASIC and said, is this okay? Are there any red flags over this? And that was in 2016. And when she called ASIC, we now know from the subsequent inquiry that we got up in 2021, 2022, ASIC had already received complaints about Sterling and had marked them no further action, right?
Yeah. And told her and others that there was no problem.
No problem.
As did the state equivalent agency in Western Australia.
Consumer Affairs it's called. And in fact, Consumer Affairs had actually noticed there was a problem with the structure of the product that Sterling was offering. And instead of warning the victims, the potential victims, they got in and said, we'll help you make this legal.
Yeah. Redesign this so it's legal and looks legit when we know it's not.
So, and the other point I'd like to make about the Sterling case, Richard, is that, and this is not to cast aspersions on the other, there's hundreds of thousands of other financial victims in Australia. We're going to talk about them quite a lot. But a lot of the schemes that collapse and people lose money, there's a certain get-rich-quick element to them. And it's not necessarily get rich quick, but it's like, okay, this will make you, this will be good for you.
They're sold as investments and people go in intending
to
invest to make money.
I want to make money out of this. Quick plug, news.com.au has a journalist named Alexis Turner Cohen, who at the moment is producing a podcast called The Missing $49 Million. And if you like podcasts, you look up it on Spotify, etc. That's what it's called, The Missing $49 Million. And that's about a scheme that collapsed, and that was definitely a get-rich-quick scheme. People who lost their money put their money in, being told, look, this thing's going to be bigger than Google. They were promised, right? And they lost all their money. Doesn't mean they deserve to lose it, but that's what can happen. You can be sucked in by the promise. Look, you're going to do well out of this, right? It can impair your judgment. That wasn't the case of Sterling victims.
No,
they weren't trying to get rich quick. They were trying to downsize and just be comfortable, right?
Yep.
And now that it's gone haywire, they're all facing eviction and homelessness. Some have been evicted already, and a bunch of them have died. And we had a website going where we told the victims' stories. And one of the things that comes out when you're a victim of something like this, people find it hard to tell their stories, and especially they find it hard to tell their stories to the people closest to them, because there's a lot of shame in losing money. There's a lot of shame in being sucked in. And when you're an outsider and you hear these people feel ashamed, you don't judge them. Of course, you know they don't deserve to feel ashamed, but they do, right? And a lot of people, elderly people who are victims of Sterling, have already passed away with that cloud hanging over them, right? And it's really tragic. So that went to an inquiry. It showed that ASIC failed, etc. And we said at the time, look, this is grounds for compensation. This is an example where for $18.5 million, the government can compensate for ASIC's failings over 100 victims and stop them from being evicted and going homeless, right? And when you can consider the other things that governments have compensated for, Brittany Higgins was one.
Yep,
right?
$20 million to one person.
No questions asked. $2 million to one person.
$2 million. $2 million. The $20 million was a different thing.
To one person, no questions asked, right? Or there was a Liberal staffer who was somehow romantically involved with former Minister Alan Tudge, right? She got $750,000. No questions asked. These people, they only need a couple of $100,000 each, and it'll keep them in their homes. And when you see ASIC's failings, this was grounds for compensation. Now, just before we go on, as an aside here, we wish we had more time to spend on this, but the week before last, I interviewed John Adams at this desk on the ASIC inquiry, because John Adams had actually participated in the Sterling ASIC inquiry, and then he built on from that, and that got turned into an even bigger inquiry into ASIC, and now that inquiry has handed down its recommendations to abolish ASIC, etc. But I can say this, the kind of reporting that's coming out of the media now is extraordinary. ASIC is an agency under siege. The attention that we have succeeded in bringing onto them, we charge that the reason ASIC failed in a case like Sterling is they were designed to fail. they were set up by the banks to be a deliberately weak and ineffective regulator, so they never bothered the banks, but that means they can't police the rest of the financial system either, right? And the way, and it's rigged regulation, but the way it's rigged is it's rigged at the top with the way they appoint the people to run ASIC, but there's 2,000 staff members of ASIC, and a lot of them joined ASIC thinking they're going to regulate the financial system. And they are completely demoralised. Morale has never been lower in this agency. It's probably the lowest of any agency in the history of Australia. There's an article in ABC this week saying where an ASIC insider leaked to ABC, said staff are crying at their desks over the way they're being treated by management, who are always intervening and stopping them, investigating, etc. Right? This is extraordinary, the kind of coverage we're seeing now. So that's good. That's actually a very good development because it means something has to give. If the Albanese government doesn't shape up and do something about this agency, then they will be proving, how corrupt they are. We're going to talk a bit about that. Anyway, that's ASIC. So we said the government should compensate the sterling victims. Problem is, the government didn't think so. They had no intention to compensate them. They refused. And because the report came out before the 2022 election, Albanese wasn't in government, and so the Labor Party, they were trying to pretend they were the champions of the sterling victims, but they said, we can't outright compensate you. You just can't do something like that, even though they did it to Brittany Higgins. But what we will do is include you in the compensation scheme of last resort. Now, I got proof that this is the promise that they made. So we're going to put it on the screen. What you're going to see here, these are Facebook posts from the Sterling Action Group in Western Australia. And the photo you're looking at there, at the bottom of that post, that is Stephen Jones in April 2022. And Stephen Jones is the Assistant Treasurer now. When he was the Shadow Assistant Treasurer, that's Stephen Jones addressing the sterling victims in Mandurah. And that's when he promised them that they would be included in the compensation scheme of last resort, because the compensation scheme of last resort would cover managed investment schemes, which is what sterling was claimed to be. So that's when he made the promise. The proof he made the promise is these subsequent Facebook posts made by the sterling victims themselves, where you can see them discussing, and I've highlighted there in the highlight, that they promised to include us include managed investment schemes in the compensation scheme of last resort. So they've confirmed in those posts that you can see there that this was the promise that was made. And then after Labor won the election, one of the sterling activists over there says we're going to hold Labor accountable to this promise to include the managed investment schemes in the compensation scheme of last resort. Did it happen? No. Jones broke his promise straight away. They betrayed the sterling victims, had no intention of including them in this scheme so they could get any kind of compensation. But he didn't just betray the sterling victims. He actually betrayed more than 100,000 Aussies who have all been victims of managed investment schemes, because the recommendation of the Royal Commission was that the compensation scheme of last resort should be retrospective back to 2008, and it should include managed investment schemes. Yeah. And that's a huge number of people. They were, it's closer to 200,000 Australians were victims of more than 190 failed and frozen funds, managed investment schemes, with total losses of $43 billion, right? That's what was finally going to be addressed, supposedly, by this compensation scheme of last resort.
Yeah. This is just, it's called that because this is people, the money's gone.
Yeah.
There's nowhere else to get it back from. This is a government compensation program of people who, and not just everyone who put money into a dud investment. This is scams.
Yes, that's right.
That, things that were sold as something they were not, whether, that people were defrauded of this money.
Now, so Labor promised this is what they would do, and they didn't do it. They enacted the compensation scheme of last resort to not include managed investment schemes and to not be retrospective. So you are only covered by that compensation scheme of last resort if you are a victim of a collapsed investment from 7th of September 2022 onwards. That's what was passed in 2022. Why did they break that promise? Well, you can guess.
Yep. Starts with B.
Protect the banks. Because so many of those schemes were bank-related schemes. And the banks were justifiably being looked at to say you should be compensating these people, right? It was the banks that were supposed to be on the hook for this. And when you think, well, $43 billion is a lot of money, what would that do? Would the banks be able to come up with that kind of money? Remember, it's $43 billion is covering everybody since 2008. So in the 16 years since then, you've got to compare the $43 billion in losses to how much money the banks have made in profit in those 16 years. These are, if you just took an average of $20 billion a year, that's $320 billion in profits. And they make, between the big four make more than $20 billion a year in profits, right? So it's just 10% probably in reality of their profits over that period, right? That should have been used to compensate these victims. So what you can do is the government can pony up the money and slug the banks going forward a regular amount to pay in retrospect. You can make the banks pay for this and other contributors as well, but make the banks pay for it. But that's what the banks would absolutely refuse to countenance. And of course, Jones did what they asked, because that's what Jones does. Last week, we discussed how Jones is protecting the banks. The same Stephen Jones, is protecting the banks from being made to pay compensation for bank clients who are victims of online scams that the banks are partly responsible for. Which in the UK, the banks up there have said, yes, we will cover those losses from online scams. And so this was being talked about here, and Jones said, no way, no how, the banks are not going to cover those losses here. And again, you've got to look at it in perspective. Last year, there were $2.4 billion in losses, scam losses in Australia. And could the banks cover that? Well, total bank profits last year were $32 billion. Of course they could cover that. And the UK bank's arguments is, by covering it, having to cover it, the banks actually do a lot more to make sure it doesn't happen, right? So, but that's Jones. He protects the banks. I'm going to put a couple of headlines on the screen for you because we haven't finished prosecuting this guy yet. He did the same thing in November 2022, Richard, when it came to another recommendation of the Royal Commission, which was that bankers should be personally fined if they're responsible for the misconduct of banks.
They even had a name for it. They called it the BEAR, the Bank Executive Accountability Regime.
Exactly. So they had dropped that idea, and in November 2022, the Greens did a deal with the government to say, we will pass this piece of legislation for you if you go back to enacting fines for bankers. So it's not just the shareholders who pay the fines, and the shareholders aren't responsible for the bad behaviour in the banks. It's the bankers themselves. If they're found responsible for some big scam that banks have committed, they should get $1 million fines. So look at this headline from the 23rd of November 2022. The day the deal was done between the Greens and Labor, the Sydney Morning Herald headline, $1 million fines for dodgy bankers. And I kid you not, within 24 hours, this is the headline in the same Sydney Morning Herald the very next day, $1 million fines dumped after bankers raised legitimate concerns. And what had happened? Anna Bligh from the Banking Association and the CEOs of the big four banks had all called Stephen Jones and Jim Chalmers, the Treasurer, and said, no way, no how, this ain't happening. And they dropped it like that, right? So 2 weeks ago, there's now evidence that everyone's starting to notice this about Stephen Jones, because 2 weeks ago, we've got a quote here. The Australian newspaper's margin call column wrote this about Stephen Jones, quote, "The well-worn cliche is that politicians are always acting at the behest of someone influential, a deep-pocketed backer with incredible force exertion over their office." I like that term. And when it comes to Assistant Treasurer Stephen Jones, it's sadly, unmistakably true. Just try to name a minister who's been more thoroughly played by stakeholders. In Jones's case, his masters occupy the deep leather chairs of the Australian Banking Association, led by the indomitable former Queensland Premier Anna Bligh. Not only is Jones wrapped tightly around her finger, but this is also the worst kept secret in Canberra. We have it on impeccable authority that the ABA, that is the Banking Association, all but writes the minister's speaking notes. That's what you're dealing with this particular minister. So that's his pedigree, right? That's his CV. Now we'll get to the point of why we're covering this story, because it gets worse. It turns out, Richard, that the version of the CSLR, the Compensation Scheme of Last Resort, that Jones passed, that excludes retrospective cases and excludes managed investment schemes that cover almost 200,000 people and $43 billion in losses, made an exception for one failed enterprise, something called Dixon Advisory. Dixon Advisory clients are being compensated, even though theirs is a retrospective case
And a managed investment scheme.
Essentially, at its core, a managed investment scheme. I'll explain that in a second. Dixon is actually a financial advice firm, but they're a vertically integrated one, and that means they make the products, they create the schemes that they advise their customers, their clients to invest in, and that is always bad. That creates conflicts of interest, etc. Right? So they were getting their clients to invest in funds that they had set up, and one of them, which went really bad, was a fund that invested in United States real estate. So in 2022, that fund collapsed in value, and this was long before the CSLR passed, and Dixon went into administration. The clients, like I said, are being included in the Compensation Scheme of Last Resort. There's an organisation called the Association of Independently Owned Financial Professionals, and their CEO is a guy named Peter Johnson. In fact, Peter Johnson I've also interviewed for Citizens Insight a couple of years ago about Sterling and related matters then. His organisation has referred this case of Dixon Advisory to the National Anti-Corruption Commission. Why? Because it turns out that Dixon Advisory was based in Canberra. It was founded in the 80s by a Canberra resident, and it's always been headquartered in Canberra, and therefore most of its clients are Canberra public servants. Right? The people who are investing in these things work in the government in Canberra, including at least 4 officials from Treasury, which designed the Compensation Scheme of Last Resort.
Nice work if you can get it.
And more, one person who was a financial advisor at Dixon's has since been parachuted into Treasury to run the section of Treasury that regulates financial advisors. So she's from this failed firm, and it's a woman, who's now been parachuted in. And the reason this organisation, Peter Johnson's Association of Independently Owned Financial Professionals, is speaking out is because his members are being slugged a very big levy to pay the cost of the compensation. This is what's called industry funded.
Yeah.
Right? They're not going to pay the cost. They want the industry to pay it. So the problem, this makes them really angry because Peter Johnson's organisation has always campaigned against vertical integration. Because what their argument, as he explained to me when I interviewed him, their argument is they are independent financial planners, which means they don't work for the banks. A lot of financial planners who work for the banks had terrible reputations. That's what helped lead to the Royal Commission in 2018. They don't work for the banks. They're totally independent. So they try and assess the products that they're advising their clients to go into, and they're not getting kickbacks from it or stuff like that. And when they see vertical integration, where you have these financial advice firms that are so large they're creating their own products, they just see that as a conflict of interest, and they have been railing against it, but now they're being slugged the levy to pay for this scheme, except this is a scheme that shouldn't qualify under the CSLR. No other like scheme qualifies. Why does this scheme qualify? And the only thing that, well, it doesn't even really make sense, but Peter Johnson calls it the stench of corruption, because isn't it interesting that the one scheme, the one historic scheme of losses on managed investment schemes that is being compensated under Stephen Jones's CSLR is one that covers Canberra public servants, including Treasury officials, and it's Treasury that designed the scheme. So this stinks to high heaven, and compare that with the government's absolute callousness and disregard for truly needy financial victims like the Sterling victims, right, who face eviction and homelessness, and what you see is the whole system has to be cleaned out.
Yep.
All right, so that's why we call it Treasury stealing the only lifeboat. You know, stuff everybody else, Treasury officials first. Okay, Richard, let's move on. And this one is what we're about to discuss now is even bigger because it's certainly having a enormous direct impact on Australians every day. The transnational swindle robbing Australians blind. So last week, Elisa and I did this show because it was the 50th anniversary of the joint sitting of Parliament at which Rex Connor introduced his bill to buy back the farm, right? Assert Australian control over Australia's resources.
Yep, the Petroleum and Minerals Authority.
That's right. That ultimately failed because of the politics and it helped lead to the Whitlam dismissal, etc. This week we're going to talk about one of the long-term consequences of that failing. And we'll start with a very fascinating development with the Reserve Bank, because the Reserve Bank got into sort of like I don't know if you'd call it a war of words, but they indicated a conflict with the government over the question of inflation, because the question of inflation is Australia's inflation is still above the target range, so it's still high, and the Reserve Bank's job is to get it down, and of course their tool, they claim they have one tool, which is interest rates. And
which they acknowledge is a blunt instrument that they just beat everyone over the head with.
That's right. So they want to suffocate the economy so no one can spend, but the government is spending money, and so this leads to a false debate between the Reserve Bank and the government over spending or not spending. But the Reserve Bank in the middle of that false debate actually said something that we thought was correct, because they said the government should actually be doing something about one of the root causes of inflation, which is
gas prices.
So
and
explain how
therefore
that
energy
works.
prices. So the gas price, the so-called national, there's an East Coast gas market. WA is not connected.
Yep.
It's got its own gas that it reserves a portion of 15% for domestic use. Just about everyone else who produces gas, any country, Qatar has its own fund that sells the gas directly. It doesn't let a cartel control gas exports.
Well, because you raised it, I've got to say this. This is what I tell people. If you watch the 2022 World Cup, which was in Qatar, right, the World Cup, or last year.
The soccer
World Cup.
Yeah, last year, I believe.
2023. So if you watch that World Cup, this is a tiny country, and they hosted the biggest sporting competition in the world. It's even bigger than the Olympics, the Soccer World Cup, in air-conditioned stadiums in the middle of the deserts. How did that country afford to do that? Because in the same period, because they are Australia's main competitor for exporting gas.
Liquefied natural gas. It goes head. It's like a neck-and-neck horse race.
Neck-and-neck horse race.
This year, that year.
But in exactly the same period that Australian governments made 800 million in royalties and taxes from our gas exports, Qatar made 26 billion.
Yep.
That's the difference.
And they sold marginally less gas that year.
That's the difference. So they assert controls, which we don't.
They have a sovereign company like the Petroleum and Minerals Authority was supposed to be, that does all of that, and they get all the money. WA reserves and a lot of other places that produce natural gas and other commodities. They reserve a portion of it for local use, and so I forget what the current gas price is in Western Australia, but it's a fraction of what we're paying over here.
But also just so people are clear, because we have expensive gas, this actually has a bearing on total energy prices and therefore the cost of living across the board.
Yeah, because of various market mechanisms and the way that they've designed things. Basically, the contract gas price sets the price of electricity.
Right.
A lot of it's to do with just all the peaking gas generation, the gas turbines that they put in to fill in the gaps when the renewables go bonkers that we were talking, drop right out when the sun doesn't shine like we were talking about earlier.
And because literally the economy is it's all energy. It's all about energy, right? The cost of everything goes up when energy is expensive.
Energy goes up. And the RBA's interest rate hammer, blunt instrument, can't do anything about that. And so what happened was last Wednesday at a Senate committee hearing that was held in Sydney, I forget the name of the committee, but the Reserve Bank's chief economist, Sarah Hunter, Dr. Hunter, an actual doctor of economics, not like Jim Chalmers, said, well, basically said, look, because Chalmers claims that these energy rebates, so-called, which are actually a taxpayer-funded subsidy to the energy cartel, he says they're disinflationary because it's bringing down this nominal price of one of the basket of goods and services that goes into factoring the consumer price index, which is how they measure inflation. All his critics, the austerity mongers, say, no, it's inflationary because if households aren't spending that money on their power bills, they're going to go and spend it on something else, and that's bad, right? You know, like kids' school books or food or something, God forbid.
God forbid.
And so what the RBA, this Hunter lady, said is, well, it's neither one nor the other. It's a net zero. It's a zero-sum game because you're robbing Peter to pay Paul, basically. It's coming out of people's taxes instead of out of their pockets directly, but...
So you're not getting costs down, you're just papering over.
You're papering over and pretending that, and they also forecast for that reason that as soon as these rebates end, they're only in place for a year, just over a year. The last of them pays out in December of next year, supposedly. And so inflation's just going to bounce straight back up above target as soon as they stop. So the implication of it, and we've quoted a couple of analysts, or one in particular from Macro Business, David Llewellyn-Smith, who's very good on resource economics. Just don't ask him anything about China.
No.
He goes bonkers. But on this stuff, his bread and butter job, he's one of the best around. He says what the RBA is saying here is you fix this because we can't, and we're not cutting interest rates to make you look good just because you say you've brought inflation down.
And by fix this, they mean actually get the price of gas down, and the only way to do that is a gas reservation scheme on the East Coast.
Yeah, price controls and reservation. There's emergency powers the government can invoke, and even without specific powers, they can still do it. Everyone does it all the time. It's called force majeure. It's an accepted practice companies forced by government intervention to break their contracts aren't legally liable. So the gas cartel whinging about this, and this is Santos, Woodside, Origin are the main ones on the East Coast. There's others, Chevron and Inpex, the Japanese state-owned company that operates out of the Northern Territory. It owns the export plant up there. It's not connected to the East Coast market, but in no particular order.
So those companies are opposed to a gas reservation scheme, but so too is the Japanese government.
Yeah. So,
because Japan was our first big gas export customer, and I think and they're one of the big ones, and probably South
they buy
Korea
a lot of gas. They were buying it from Russia. They were buying it from Qatar. Now they get a lot of it from us. Why do they buy it from us? Well, because in a lot of cases, and Michael West Media, one of the first articles they published when West started that back in 2016 was called "It's a Gas."
Yeah.
Australian gas is dirt cheap if you're in Japan, basically, or something like that.
It's our gas. We get charged through the nose for it if we use it.
Yeah.
But the Japanese people get to use it even after it's been shipped there, much cheaper than we get.
So it comes out of the ground for $1 to $2 per gigajoule. That's a measure of the energy you get when you burn it, for anyone who doesn't know. They sell it here. There's this fake price cap that Albanese put in place that's effectively become a price floor. They break it with impunity, and it's hardly ever dropped below that since. This is about a year ago. So, but overseas, they got to just sell it for whatever the market rate is. And so a lot of times, and this has been going on, as I said, for years and years, a lot of times we'll be paying more for our own gas without it having to go through being liquefied and shipped than what these export customers in places like Japan, Korea and China and wherever else are paying, Singapore. Why? Because the stupid Gillard government, where all of these clowns running the show now, or whoever's pretending to run the show, they were all the senior people in Albanese's cabinet, including Albanese himself, were all ministers in that government.
That's right.
They're the idiots who gave the gas cartel, the gas exporters, carte blanche to hook up all of the existing supply to their export terminals without any legal recourse, without any guarantees of local supply or pricing, like everyone else in the world who does these kind of operations has.
So essentially they're prioritising the export market over Australia's domestic market, which is why you need a domestic reservation scheme.
Yeah.
But
so they can create the exporters can create a shortage here, charge whatever they want, and make up the difference for if they're taking a hit on the international
so
spot price.
naturally, Richard, there's a debate about this in Australia, and it turns out the Japanese aren't happy we're having this debate. Our ally, Japan, is not happy we're having this debate because their former ambassador to Australia, Shingo Yamagami, he has attacked the idea of us having a reservation scheme as energy nationalism, and he said it's a direct threat to Japan's economy. I'll just read you the quote that you published here. Japan has this. This is the Fin Review reported. Japan imports 40% of its gas from Australia, and by 2030 will still need gas to generate 20% of its electricity. If the Greens proposal, and they're talking about the reservation, goes ahead, it will completely weaken Japan as an economic powerhouse. This is the prediction. Mr. Shingo said, quote, economic activity will come to a halt and that will damage Japan's standing in this severe strategic environment. Do the Greens want a strategically weak Japan? That will affect the strategic position of Australia. Now, how credible is that sentence?
Well, if anyone ever hands you a $3 note, this is slightly less credible than one of those.
Right.
So the Greens have proposed, they want to get rid of gas and fossil fuels altogether, but in the meantime, they believe their own line. The one thing about the Greens, they don't, even if they're wrong about stuff, at least they believe what they're saying.
That's right.
So they want to get rid of gas altogether, but in the meantime, this as a transition fuel, to this renewable thing, there's everybody's getting screwed on the cost of living by this nonsense, this gas price, this export cartel. One Nation is on the same page.
Yep.
They want to nationalise it the same as we do. The Greens aren't quite that far yet, maybe, not officially.
Yep.
So they've proposed a gas reservation policy, again, like what WA has.
Yep.
And the Japanese are hitting the roof about it. This is the recent former ambassador, but it's the same line coming out of their gas companies. There was reports a couple of months ago when some of these reporters from AFR went over there and got wined and dined and, soft whispers in their ears and all the rest of it. So what's really happening? Well, David Llewellyn-Smith, who I mentioned before from Macro Business, and I won't quote him directly, but in the euphemism would be screw Japan.
That's right.
Because it turns out, they're importing all this gas from Australia at whatever bargain price they're getting it for. They're selling it again because they're buying more than they need, and they're on-selling it, which means they wouldn't be doing that if it weren't at a profit. The last 3 years, it's been slightly more than the entire amount that they've imported from Australia. Most of their gas comes from the West Coast and their own plant that their state-owned company, Inpex, has bought the license to. They've set up their own export terminal in the Northern Territory offshore gas field. I forget the name of it. That's not connected to the East Coast, but the amount that they buy from the East Coast is enough. If we just reserve that little bit, which they could easily replace and don't need anyway, well, we could solve all our current energy price worries for the next, or David guy says, for the next decade and potentially forever, and it wouldn't hurt them at all. I mean, far from bringing their economy to its knees, they'd barely notice the difference.
David Llewellyn-Smith says, if we just reserve the 80 to 100 petajoules that Japan imports from us, then that would...
From the East Coast.
From the East Coast.
Yeah.
That would solve all our problem for a decade and potentially forever, because Japan is on-selling 1,600 petajoules.
1,600.
It's importing 100 from us, on-selling 1,600 from all the sources it gets gas, yet this clown, this former ambassador, accused us of strategically weakening Japan if we have a reservation scheme in Australia. Now, this guy deserves zero respect. I detest this former Japanese ambassador because an ambassador is supposed to be a diplomat. This guy in the period in like 2020, 21, 2022 in Australia when he was an ambassador here, he was in there with the most feral xenophobes in this country, whipping up hysteria and hatred and war against China. None of his business. He should have been kicked out of the damn country because he's our ally. And the poor old the current Chinese ambassador came to Australia, gave a press conference where all he stated was Chinese policy for 50 years on things like the One China policy. The media, Sarah Ferguson had an hysterical attack on him. I remember going after him, a very rude interview that she did with him, right? And then she gets this clown on, right, so that he could make all his accusations against China. Yet what we're telling you people is these are the bastards who my grandfather fought in World War II on the Kokoda track. They're still damn screwing us. And that's okay because they're our allies. They're allowed to screw us.
Yep. And the Albanese government agrees because that's the next bit of the story.
Exactly. So tell us about that because Rex Patrick has actually revealed something blew me away, this part, because it's so bad. This screwing of Australians over gas is so bad and so... There's absolutely no reason for it. It's totally unjustifiable that he even talked the Liberals in 2019 into agreeing to look at a gas reservation scheme for the East Coast.
Yep.
Because he smartly went to Matthias Cormann, who was one of the most powerful ministers in the Morrison government, but who was a West Australian Liberal.
Yep.
And he went over to West Australia and said, this is what we've got to do. And how could Matthias Cormann, a West Australian Liberal, enjoying cheap West Australian gas because they've got a gas reservation scheme, say no? So this actually led to a policy they were scoping it out. It was only interrupted by COVID. But what's happening now?
Well, they put out what's called an options paper. And this was internal to the Morrison government at the time. And it was commissioned, when it was commissioned, Matt Canavan was resource minister, and he's one of... and he's a little bit bonkers on China too, just quietly.
Sorry, Matt, you are.
But again, if he says something, it's because he believes it's true, and if he's wrong, he'll acknowledge it and change his mind. He's one of the more principled people I know of in the Parliament, and for that reason, he later resigned as resource minister after the Nationals leadership spill. And so, but this was commissioned when he was there. He went over there. He was one of the ones that Rex Patrick talking to about this, and they said, yep, let's do it. They got an options paper put together, and then all the COVID stuff happened. Morrison started changing his tune on gas, and we're going to do this gas-fired recovery thing. But then they buried the paper. So Rex Patrick applies for it. I think I might have called him Rex Connor earlier. Anyway, Rex Patrick...
Former South Australian Senator.
And also no friend of China.
No.
He applies for this under Freedom of Information. The Albanese government refuses to release anything. This is the last government's options paper of a policy that was never actually implemented in the first place. Nothing. Not a word. So, he said that's where it usually ends. He says, but he stumped up over $1,000 of his own money to take it to the Administrative Appeals Tribunal. They agreed to hear the appeal. As soon as that happened, he said it's standard operating procedure, the government released half the document, but they wouldn't release any of the policy options. And why not?
Why?
Well, the appeals tribunal heard the case, including secret evidence from the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, given in camera to the I forget the name of the official, the judge that heard the case, but and a secret affidavit, neither of which Rex Patrick was allowed to know the contents of. But in the ruling, the DFAT lawyer made the very same arguments that Mr. Shingo, the warmongering, lying former ambassador, and you can sue me, mate. Go ahead.
Go ahead, yeah.
Basically the same arguments, and the Administrative Appeals Tribunal bought it, and that's the Albanese government's line. In other words, because this is the line they sent this guy to argue, because they said, as Rex Patrick
strategically weaken Japan.
It would weaken their. It would have a material impact on their economy, and therefore, if we had these things about gas reservation, which again, they're not saying what the policy options were that were being discussed, but that would affect our international relations with our allies because it would weaken it would have a material impact on the economy of Japan, as well as South Korea and Singapore they threw in there. This is what they're arguing. In other words, he says this is the Albanese government's position. The effect of this argument and this ruling is that Australians are not allowed to debate domestic energy policy if it upsets Japan.
And that is because Japan is under this strategic umbrella.
Yeah, we're bringing them in on AUKUS. We're bringing them in with all this training and potential. They're even talking about potential joint basing in the north of Australia. They get to see all the things that their grandfathers didn't in 42.
Seriously, when are Australians going to take their heads out of their ass on this? Everywhere on this strategic stuff, we are getting screwed every way we turn. We're getting we've got to pay $368 billion for submarines we're never going to get anyway. We'll do more on that next week. And this is an example where you are being robbed blind every time you turn on your gas or every time you buy something in Australia because of the price of energy. And this clown, Anthony Albanese, is so weak and so submissive to the Americans, he's accepting that our strategic obligation to this broad alliance against China, who does nothing but pay us handsomely for everything we sell it. We have the best we have the best trade relationship with China of any country on earth.
The only thing keeping our terms of trade in the black at all.
The country that's never screwed us financially, and they only cut off those trade in certain products because we were such obnoxious arseholes to them, run by a lunatic, happy clapper, American sycophant named Scott Morrison, right? Even John Alexander went on that show and said, if you really wanted to forget all this garbage about a proper investigation to COVID, he deliberately went about it in the most provocative way, and John Alexander called that. Anyway, so apart from that one hiccup, we've never done nothing but well out of China. These guys are robbing us blind, and they're saying, yeah, but strategic reasons, you got to be prepared to bend over and get robbed blind, right? When are we going to snap out of it?
Buy stocks in Vaseline in the meantime, I guess.
So be angry, and look, this is why we'll be talking about this more approaching the election. One of the fundamental policies the Citizens Party is campaigning for is an independent foreign policy, because you can see how this independent, this strategic foreign policy stuff becomes used as an excuse to rob us blind on all fronts.
And another one is to nationalise the resource base.
Absolutely. And a domestic gas scheme is a no. If even Matthias Cormann, right,
Mr. OECD,
can see the sense in it, understand just how bad it is, how the Albanese government's protecting this now. Anyway, all right, calm down now, but not long term. We'll keep it on a slow burn. Richard, thank you very much.
Thanks, Robbie.
That was very enlightening. Thanks to the viewer for tuning in. And, I hope you got the point. One last comment. Earlier I was talking about Dan Duggan, of course, which is not an unrelated thing. He's facing everything he's facing because of our subservience to the United States. We'll put the link below where you can make a donation to his fighting fund as well, because, like I said before, the family needs all the help they can get. But otherwise, thanks for tuning into the Citizens Report, and tune in next week for more.
Authorised by Robert Barwick, Citizens Party, Melbourne.